Where are you watching from? Midnight, dawn, or somewhere in between? Half asleep, headphones on, trying to escape into a darker corner of history? You're in the right place. Drop your location and the exact time in the comments. It helps summon this strange little community of night owls, insomniacs, and history addicts scattered across the world. Now, dim the lights. Turn your screen brightness down. Let's begin. Picture the year 1206. On the steppes of Mongolia, a man is declared the supreme ruler of the tribes, Genghis Khan. His armies will one day carve out the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known, stretching from the Pacific to the gates of Europe. But his power was not just measured in cavalry charges and burning cities. His dominance extended into the most private spaces of human life. For Genghis Khan, conquest did not end when the battlefield quieted. It continued in tents, chambers, and harems. The chronicles left behind, Persian accounts, Chinese records, and even whispers from within his own court, speak of a man whose appetite for control was boundless. Victory in war meant the bodies of the conquered were his spoils. Women were seized as prizes, their fates tied not to their own choices, but to the whims of the conqueror. Marriage, concubinage, and outright sexual violence became instruments of rule. And this wasn't unique to Genghis, but he elevated it to a scale history had rarely seen. He institutionalized the practice. His generals and soldiers followed his lead, taking women from every city, village, and palace they stormed. For the Mongols, women were as much a part of the plunder as horses or gold. Conquest was total. Even noble women were not spared. Defeated kings and khans often saw their daughters and wives claimed by the man who had destroyed their world. A marriage to Genghis was less union than humiliation, a final insult to the dynasties he toppled. To refuse was unthinkable. Defiance was met with extermination. Persian chroniclers, horrified, recorded that after the fall of Khwarizm, Genghis Khan's forces rounded up noble families. Sons were executed, but daughters were absorbed into the Mongol harem. The empire expanded not only across maps, but within bloodlines. To conquer a people meant to break their women, folding them into the conqueror's household and erasing their past. This policy had devastating consequences. For many women, survival meant submission. For their communities, the trauma was lasting. Entire generations carried the scars of conquest, not only in ruined cities, but in bloodlines reshaped by force. Modern genetic studies even suggest that nearly 1 in 200 men alive today descend directly from Genghis Khan. It is not only a statistic of fertility, it is a statistic of violence. So, when we speak of his empire, we must look beyond the battles. Genghis Khan's true conquest was written into bodies, families, and legacies. The horsemen swept across Asia with fire and arrows, but what they left behind was more intimate, more insidious, and far harder to erase. And as we move deeper, you'll see that what many have called the greatest conqueror also orchestrated one of history's most horrific systems of sexual exploitation, so vast it reshaped civilizations. The empire Genghis Khan built on horseback was mirrored by another empire, one made not of cities or soldiers, but of women. His household, sprawling and meticulously organized, functioned as both a harem and a political machine. And in many ways, it reveals more about how he wielded power than his most famous battles. Unlike the Ottoman harems of later centuries, the Mongol version was less a single palace complex and more a network of encampments. Genghis Khan maintained multiple households across his vast domain, each staffed with wives, concubines, and attendants. When he traveled, entire retinues of women traveled with him, their camps set up in carefully ordered rows of felt tents. Each wife had her own ordo, a separate court, complete with servants, guards, and resources. His principal wife, Berta, held the highest authority. Married to him before his rise, she was the queen of queens, the one whose sons were considered legitimate heirs. Yet even her position did not shield her from rivalry. For every new conquest brought new women into the fold, princesses from fallen dynasties, noble daughters forced into marriage, and countless concubines captured in raids. Berta's tent may have been the largest, but it was surrounded by dozens more, each housing women whose presence represented both plunder and politics. The scale was staggering. Chroniclers wrote that Genghis Khan took wives from the rulers he defeated, not as romantic unions, but as statements of dominance. A captured princess was more than a bride. She was proof that the old dynasty was finished, its bloodline absorbed into the conqueror's household. Her marriage was not just personal humiliation, but national defeat. And then there were the concubines. Women taken from ordinary households, herded alongside livestock and valuables, became property of the Khan. Some were distributed among generals, but many were kept for his own use. Within the harem, rank determined everything. Noblewomen might become advisors, their voices carrying influence in court decisions, while concubines lived and died unnamed, their identities erased in the shadow of the empire. But here's the darker twist. The harem wasn't simply indulgence. It was strategy. Women became the glue of Mongol diplomacy. By marrying into a conquered family, Genghis Khan both neutralized potential rivals and bound their remaining members to him through forced kinship. His sons and generals followed suit, creating a tangled web of marriages that extended the empire's reach into Persia, China, Korea, and beyond. The harem, then, was not merely private. It was public policy. The tent walls concealed personal acts, but the consequences radiated across continents. The women within were pawns, their bodies written into treaties, their children shaping the future of empires. And yet, for all its structure, life inside the harem was precarious. Competition between women could be deadly. A whisper against a rival might end with exile. Or worse. Some wielded influence over Genghis Khan's decisions. Others vanished into silence. To survive meant adapting, scheming, and hoping the next dawn did not bring another marriage into captivity. The machinery of the harem was efficient, vast, and relentless. It reflected the empire itself, built on conquest, maintained through fear, and always expanding. And at its heart was Genghis Khan, the man whose hunger for control extended far beyond the battlefield, into the most intimate spaces of life. To understand how Genghis Khan weaponized marriage, you have to picture the scene after a city fell. The gates burned, the defender slaughtered, and in the ashes stood the conqueror. For most rulers, the victory would end there. For Genghis, it was only the beginning. The true humiliation of his enemies came not just through destruction, but through what happened to their families, their daughters, their wives, their queens. In Mongol custom, taking the women of a defeated ruler was not just spoils of war. It was the ultimate statement of dominance. By claiming a rival's wife or daughter, Genghis rewrote the bloodline. Dynasties that had ruled for generations were symbolically ended the moment their noble women were forced into his household. A queen who once sat on a throne became a consort in a foreign tent, her prestige shattered, her lineage absorbed into the very power that had destroyed her world. One chilling example comes from his conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire. After toppling its ruler, Genghis is said to have taken the Shah's daughters into his harem. Persian sources describe this not as romance, but as calculated humiliation. The daughters of kings forced to serve the man who had annihilated their people. In one stroke, Genghis obliterated not only armies, but dynastic pride. Widows were not spared. A ruler killed in battle often left behind a queen, who became a target of Genghis' claim. By marrying the widow, he presented himself as the rightful successor, erasing the memory of the fallen husband. For the conquered, it was an unbearable insult. The same hand that killed their king now rested on their queen's shoulder. And it wasn't just about personal conquest. These forced unions created ripple effects across politics. By binding himself to a princess of China or Persia, Genghis demanded recognition from those regions' surviving elites. The marriages were both chains and bridges, ensuring his authority stretched beyond sheer military force. For the women, however, the marriages were prisons. Imagine the silence of a queen who once commanded courts, now living in a foreign encampment, her every gesture monitored, her former status erased. Some adapted, surviving by maneuvering for influence within the harem. Others faded into obscurity, their names recorded only as footnotes in chronicles, stripped of their voices. Marriage in Genghis Khan's world was never tender. It was a tool of annihilation, a weapon as sharp as any sword, forged not from steel, but from humiliation. By taking what was most personal, family, dignity, intimacy, he ensured his enemies would not only lose their thrones, but their very sense of self. And as we move deeper, we'll see how this brutality extended even further. Because for Genghis Khan, sexual violence wasn't just humiliation. It was strategy. Cities fell to Genghis Khan, not just with arrows and fire, but with something far more intimate and devastating. Sexual violence, under his command, became more than an inevitable consequence of war. It became deliberate policy. For the Mongols, conquest wasn't complete until the survivors' spirits were broken, and nothing accomplished that more effectively than the violation of women. Chroniclers from Persia, China, and the Middle East describe it bluntly. Mongol soldiers were given free rein to plunder not only goods, but bodies. Captured women were distributed as rewards for loyalty. High-born princesses became trophies for Genghis himself, while ordinary women were treated as spoils of war for the rank and file. The message was clear. No one was beyond reach. This wasn't chaos. It was calculated terror. Sexual violence was used to shatter the will of populations before resistance could rise. A city that knew its daughters and wives would be taken often chose surrender over defiance. Rape became as much a weapon as the composite bow, ensuring that the psychological damage of conquest lasted long after the Mongols rode away. There are accounts from Nishapur, where tens of thousands were slaughtered after a revolt, and the surviving women were parceled out like livestock. In Bukhara, chroniclers describe how the finest households were emptied, with noblewomen taken directly into Mongol tents as symbols of humiliation. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic, a pattern that repeated across Central Asia, Persia, and into Eastern Europe. And at the center stood Genghis himself. He set the precedent by claiming women from conquered dynasties, and his generals imitated him. Some modern scholars argue this wasn't merely indulgence, but cold pragmatism. By spreading Mongol bloodlines everywhere, he created living reminders of his dominance. A child born of violence was still a child tied to his empire. It worked. Communities were left fractured, their cultural memory scarred. The trauma silenced resistance, and the demographic effects were staggering. Modern geneticists estimate that about 1 in 200 men alive today carry a Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan. That statistic is often celebrated as a quirky historical fact, but behind it lies the grim reality. Millions of women had no choice in shaping that legacy. The cruelty was self-perpetuating. Soldiers who knew they could claim women as part of victory fought with unmatched ferocity. Generals who built their harems on conquest tied their loyalty to the Khan who permitted it. Sexual violence was not incidental. It was institutional. And here lies the darkest truth. For Genghis Khan, conquering cities was only half the task. Conquering bodies was the other. It wasn't enough to take land and treasure. He had to engrave his power onto human lives, ensuring his shadow stretched into the most private spaces of every conquered people. When we speak of Genghis Khan's children, we aren't talking about a royal family tree. We're talking about a forest, sprawling, tangled, and still casting its shadow today. The conqueror's sexual conquests didn't just devastate populations in the moment. They left behind thousands of offspring, some legitimate heirs, many more scattered across Eurasia as living reminders of his reach. His principal wife, Berta, bore him 4 recognized sons: Yochi, Chagatai, Ogadei, and Tolui. These sons were his chosen heirs, the pillars upon which the empire was built. But even their lineage was clouded with doubt. Yochi, the eldest, was conceived around the time Berta was rescued from abduction by a rival clan. Whispers of illegitimacy haunted him all his life, fueling bitter rivalries with his brothers. In a system where bloodline meant destiny, even suspicion was poison. But beyond Berta's children, the numbers swell into the unimaginable. Every captured princess, every concubine, every enslaved woman added to the count. Contemporary sources hint that Genghis fathered dozens, perhaps hundreds of children. Some chroniclers, awed or horrified, suggested he had more offspring than any ruler in history. Whether exaggerated or not, the genetic legacy speaks for itself. In 2003, a groundbreaking genetic study revealed a startling fact. Nearly 16 million men alive today carry a Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan. That's about 1 in every 200 men on the planet. The sheer scale boggles the mind. His conquests were not just military, they were biological. His DNA became a weapon of empire, spreading across continents with every captured bride and concubine. But what sounds like a strange historical curiosity hides a darker truth. Each of those genetic imprints likely represents an act of coercion, a forced union, or outright violence. Behind the statistic lie countless women whose names are lost, their voices erased. The genetic success of Genghis Khan is built on the suffering of millions. The consequences rippled through politics as well. His legitimate heirs, the 4 sons, tore at each other in civil wars after his death, each claiming the right to rule. Illegitimate children, born of concubines and captive women, were often excluded from succession, yet they still carried Mongol blood. This created a tangled web of loyalties, rivalries, and dynasties. From Persia to China, claimants arose, some legitimate, some less so, all pointing back to the Great Khan as their ancestor. Entire dynasties emerged from this genetic flood. The Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan, was one branch. The Ilkhanate in Persia was another. Even centuries later, rulers across Central Asia proudly traced their lineage back to Genghis, using blood as a claim to power. His body, in effect, had become a political tool as powerful as his armies. And yet, with so many children, his empire fractured faster than it might have. Too many heirs, too many rivalries, too much ambition splintered what he had built. The same force that extended his legacy, his insatiable drive to dominate and reproduce, also planted the seeds of chaos. Today, when we hear that millions carry his DNA, it's tempting to laugh at the oddity, to treat it as trivia. But the real story is darker. Genghis Khan wrote his empire not only into history books, but into human bodies, leaving scars and legacies that remain in our very blood. For the men who chronicled Genghis Khan's empire, the focus was always on battles, treaties, and bloodlines. But if we shift the gaze to the women, a different empire emerges, one built on silence, fear, and survival. Behind the stories of conquest lies a darker, quieter history, the lives of those who endured him. When cities fell, women were taken as part of the plunder. Some became concubines, their names erased as soon as they entered the Mongol camps. Others were given as gifts to generals, or traded like commodities between noble households. For every princess recorded in chronicles, there were thousands of unnamed women whose stories dissolved into the dust of history. The trauma stretched across generations. Entire communities lived with the knowledge that their daughters could be carried off at any moment. Families sometimes scarred their girls intentionally, hoping to make them undesirable to Mongol soldiers. Others sent daughters into hiding, only to be dragged out when raids swept through. The fear was constant, an empire of shadows pressing down even when no cavalry was in sight. For those within the harem, survival meant adaptation. Some women learned to maneuver, whispering advice into the ears of rulers, shaping decisions behind the scenes. A few gained genuine power, queens like Berta, or later Turagena Khatun, who ruled as regents. But for everyone who rose, countless more were silenced, forgotten, or discarded when their usefulness ended. The cultural damage was immense. Dynasties toppled not only because their armies were defeated, but because their bloodlines were consumed. A princess forced to bear the children of her family, Anne's destroyer, carried humiliation into the next generation. Lineages were rewritten, histories rewritten, until entire cultures lost their sense of continuity. The conqueror's body was as effective as his cavalry in breaking nations. And yet, in the records left by Arab and Persian historians, women appear only as side notes. The daughter of so-and-so taken into Genghis's household, or the widow of a king given in marriage. Their suffering was acknowledged only in passing, as if it were simply another measure of conquest. Their pain was folded into the machinery of empire, normalized as the cost of history. But if we read between the lines, their voices emerge. The conspiracies hatched in harems, the rebellions led by women of noble blood, the quiet resistance of mothers protecting their children. These fragments reveal resilience as well as suffering. They remind us that history's silence does not mean absence, only erasure. The legacy for women was not only personal, but cultural. Across Central Asia and Persia, stories of Mongol brutality became folklore, passed down as warnings. Songs and tales carried memories of mothers and daughters stolen away, embedding trauma into the very fabric of communities. These weren't just war stories. They were survival stories, told in whispers for centuries. In the end, the aftermath for women tells us more about the true cost of Genghis Khan's empire than any battlefield map. His victories were written not only in blood and fire, but in the lives of millions of women, whose bodies bore the weight of conquest, and whose silences shaped the generations that followed. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian. But his most enduring conquest wasn't drawn on any map. It lived in bodies, in lineages, in whispered memories that outlasted dynasties. His sexual practices, as brutal as his battles, etched a legacy written not only in fear, but in blood. For the conquered, the trauma became cultural memory. In Persia and Central Asia, stories of the Mongols weren't just about sieges and massacres. They were about daughters stolen, families dishonored, and lineages erased. Mothers sang lullabies that carried warnings, reminding their children of the terror that had swept through generations earlier. Folklore became a vessel for grief, and grief became identity. Even the empire he left behind bore scars of his practices. Too many heirs meant too much rivalry. Sons from Burde fought against those from concubines. Cousins split the empire into khanates. The unity forged on horseback fractured under the weight of bloodlines stretched too thin. The very policy that expanded his legacy, seizing women, fathering countless children, helped doom the stability of his dynasty. And yet, the reach of that policy still astonishes. Geneticists estimate that around 16 million men alive today carry the Y chromosome linked to Genghis Khan. To put it in perspective, his genetic imprint is larger than some modern nations. It's a fact that sparks curiosity, even amusement, when shared online. But behind that statistic lies horror, the unrecorded suffering of women, the silence of lives turned into numbers. To his followers, Genghis's power over women was framed as proof of divine favor. A man who could command both nations and bloodlines must surely be chosen by the eternal blue sky. To his enemies, it was degradation so complete, it broke the will to resist. Either way, the message was unmistakable. No one, not even the most private family bond, was beyond the reach of the Khan. And that, perhaps, is his darkest legacy. Not just that he conquered more land than any ruler in history, but that he turned intimacy into empire, desire into domination, family into weapons. His shadow lingers, not only in ruins and chronicles, but in the DNA of millions, a biological monument to a reign built on fear. So when we remember Genghis Khan, it is not enough to recall cavalry charges and maps shaded in Mongol gray. We must also remember the women who never chose, the children born into silence, and the cultures broken from within. His empire was more than land. It was a conquest of the human body itself. You've just walked through the darkest chambers of Genghis Khan's empire. Not the battles written in textbooks, but the wounds carved into generations of families and women whose names history forgot. If this story shook you, remember, there are countless more shadows in history waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for staying with me till the end. It really does mean a lot. If you found this worth your time, please like and subscribe, and check out the other videos on the channel for more unfiltered history. And don't forget, drop your location and the exact time you're watching in the comments. It helps summon this strange little community of night owls and history addicts from every corner of the world. See you in the next one.